Now, before we discuss my 2005 edition of Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business by Neil Postman, originally published in 1985, we need to first discuss two other books, which are 1984 and Brave New World, as they are extremely important books to discuss in order to understand this book. What you need to understand about the world presented in 1984 by George Orwell is that it is a world controlled by essentially a totalitarian state. The government in 1984 is all-controlling. It's a surveillance state. The citizenry is kept constantly in fear. Free thought is a big no-no. You will end up in a labor camp. What you really need to know, a good comparison for the world presented in 1984 to like a real world civilization would be North Korea. The 1984 government is a government that tries to get its people to worship the leader, as in Big Brother, very much like how North Korea forces its citizens to worship the supreme leader. The government, it controls the people with the jackboot, and it does everything it can do to force people into believing that, just blatant falsehoods are true, like 2 + 2 = 5. Why does Orwell's government do this? So that the people can be demoralized and so that revolution cannot take place. Everything that has a good name is really for something bad. The Ministry of Truth is where they print lies. The Ministry of Love is where they torture people. Another thing you gotta understand about this world is, all your pleasures are suppressed. Pretty much anything joyful, anything fun. Sex is heavily suppressed in 1984. It's, it's just like, it's a joyless world. It's a world made joyless through force and fear. That is what you really need to understand about the world presented in this book, moving forward in this video. Now, on the flip side, the world presented in Brave New World, written by Aldous Huxley in 1931 or 32, I believe. I think it was 1932. This world is very different from the world presented in 1984. This world, as you can see on the cover, there's a man who's like being put through a machine. The idea is that in the future, Huxley hypothesized that humanity, the Industrial Revolution would industrialize everything, including all aspects of humanity. Like literally the dates in Brave New World, it's not BC and AD, it's BF and AF, before Ford and after Ford. Henry Ford essentially takes the place of Jesus Christ in Brave New World, although it is simultaneously an atheistic state. But what you really need to understand about this world is it achieves the same ends as the world in 1984, but by very different means. Brave New World is a society where people are encouraged to, just have sex with everybody. There's a drug called Soma, which has all the positive effects of heroin, methamphetamines, psychedelic drugs, but none of the negative side effects. And people are encouraged to take this drug anytime they feel, a little uncomfortable in the world, a little uneasy about things. Anytime they start feeling or thinking very strongly about anything, they're encouraged to take Soma and go have sex with somebody. It is a world where the government essentially oppresses the people by giving them all the things they want all the time. It's a world where there's information and pleasure and shallowness coming at the people at all times, and this is a part of their education. This is a part of just all aspects of their life, and the government is able to not have to bring out the jackboots, it doesn't have to put people in labor camps or anything like that. The government is just able to maintain control by, essentially understanding and manipulating the human machine, our impulses and instincts. If I've done my job well thus far, you hopefully have a decent picture of the worlds presented in Brave New World in 1984, which means that you are prepared for me to talk about this book, as this book literally deals directly with both of those worlds and comparing and contrasting them to our world. So now, without further ado, I would like to read the foreword to this book, as it sets up the first section in this video, which is called "How are we amusing ourselves to death? Now, before I read this forward, keep in mind that this book was originally published in 1985, a year after 1984, which is, of course, the year that Orwell predicted his totalitarian future would come into being. So just keep that in mind as I read this, and also note, a lot of what's in this foreword kind of covers what I just told you guys about regarding the worlds presented in Brave New World in 1984, although it goes into less detail. That's why I wanted to kind of give a more detailed explanation for the worlds presented in those aforementioned novels before reading this foreword, as I just think it's best to have as much information as possible. We were keeping our eye on 1984. When the year came and the prophecy didn't, thoughtful Americans sang softly in praise of themselves. The roots of liberal democracy had held. Wherever else the terror had happened, we, at least, had not been visited by Orwellian nightmares. But we had forgotten that alongside Orwell's dark vision, there was another, slightly older, slightly less well-known, equally chilling, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Contrary to common belief, even among the educated, Huxley and Orwell did not prophesy the same thing. Orwell warns that we will be overcome by an externally imposed oppression. But in Huxley's vision, no big brother is required to deprive people of their autonomy, maturity, and history. As he saw it, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal bumblepuppy. Those are essentially pleasure mechanisms in the world of Brave New World. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In 1984, Huxley added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. This book is about the possibility that Huxley, not Orwell, was right. Now, after me reading that very chilling foreword, you're probably, first of all, thinking to yourself, this is going to be a terrifying video, should I stop now? My reply would be, no, you should not stop watching now, but you are correct in that it's going to be a terrifying video, so buckle up. Also, you're probably wondering, by what means does Postman believe this Huxleyan nightmare is to come into being? And Postman's reply is television. To say it then, as plainly as I can, this book is an inquiry into and a lamentation about the most significant American cultural fact of the second half of the 20th century, the decline of the age of topography and the ascendancy of the age of television. This changeover has dramatically and irreversibly shifted the content and meaning of public discourse, since two media so vastly different cannot accommodate the same ideas. As the influence of print wanes, the content of politics, religion, education, and anything else that comprises public business must change and be recast in terms that are most suitable to television. Before we discuss the passage I just read, I would like to first read another passage on page 27, as it falls pretty much directly in line with the passage we just read on page 8. It further fleshes out Postman's central thesis. My argument is limited to saying that a major new medium changes the structure of discourse. It does so by encouraging certain uses of the intellect, by favoring certain definitions of intelligence and wisdom, and abandoning a certain kind of content. In a phrase, by creating new forms of truth-telling. I will say once again that I am no relativist in this matter, and that I believe the epistemology created by television not only is inferior to a print-based epistemology, but is dangerous and absurdist. The big thing that needs to be understood after reading both of those passages is that Postman believes that the invention of the television, and most importantly, the supremacy of television over print in the second half of the 20th century, has transformed and will continue to transform all aspects of society, particularly in Western societies, as we have pretty much abandoned print and gone for this new medium. And therefore, all the ways in which we understand the world are going to be different by virtue of the fact that the television is just a different kind of technology than the book, and therefore it allows for certain kinds of ideas to proliferate while others not so much. And Postman's claim is that television is inferior to print as a meaning-making and educational instrument. Now, it's also important to point out that Postman does not claim in this book that, television is a inherently evil technology. He just believes that there are more cons to it than there are pros, whereas, with the printing press, he believed that there were more pros to the printing press than there were cons. And Postman, he says on page 29, I'm not going to read this whole passage because it's quite long, but he essentially says that, the TV is, it's a really cool technology, and hey, in the future it may prove to have great utility in certain areas, but it displacing print as the primary medium through which people understand the world and each other is a bad thing. He makes a pretty good case, which we will get to here in a moment. Moving on to page 92, I would like to read a passage where Postman essentially says what I just said about television, transforming society and all that stuff. But this passage does a really good job of fleshing out exactly what Postman means by that, and it's just very eloquently written. And so let's go ahead and read it and then freak out because of the truth. Television is our culture's principal mode of knowing about itself. Therefore, and this is the critical point, how television stages the world becomes the model for how the world is properly to be staged. It is not merely that on the television screen entertainment is the metaphor for all discourse. It is that off the screen the same metaphor prevails. As topography once dictated the style of conducting politics, religion, business, education, law, and other important social matters, television now takes command. In courtrooms, classrooms, operating rooms, boardrooms, churches, and even airplanes, Americans no longer talk to each other. They entertain each other. They do not exchange ideas. They exchange images. They do not argue with propositions. They argue with good looks, celebrities, and commercials. I have to say that Postman makes a really good point there about just how literally everything, including the way we talk to each other, has been transformed and manipulated by television, in that, obviously whenever we watch TV, people mimic what they see on TV, but whenever he says, television has transformed everything, I mean, it really has transformed our technology. Look at your phone. It's modeled off of a television screen, as is your computer. I don't know what Postman would believe about social media, but I presume he would say that it was simply an evolution of the television, in that it is all about shallowness. It is all about entertainment. We don't discuss ideas. We look good and get millions of people to follow us by taking pictures of our ass. If you'll remember, the title of this section was How Are We Amusing Ourselves to Death? From the passages I've read and some of the things I've said in combination with those passages, I believe you're probably beginning to get a decent idea of what the answer is to that question. But now I would like to read one final passage where Postman, I think, accurately describes the circus in which he lived in 1985 and the circus in which we live today. Today we must look to the city of Las Vegas, Nevada, as a metaphor of our national character and aspiration. Its symbol, a 30-foot high cardboard picture of a slot machine and a chorus girl. For Las Vegas is a city entirely devoted to the idea of entertainment, and as such proclaims the spirit of a culture in which all public discourse increasingly takes the form of entertainment. Our politics, religion, news, athletics, education, and commerce have been transformed into congenial adjuncts of show business, largely without protest or even much popular notice. The result is that we are a people on the verge of amusing ourselves to death. Dun dun dun. The next section in this video is called Those Who Read Can Know, Those Who Watch Can Only See. So at this point in the video, we've discussed how Postman believes that, the written word, the printed word, typography is a far better medium for public discourse culture than television. We've discussed that obviously this is what Postman believes, but what we haven't discussed is exactly why he believes that, and that is what this section is devoted to. Basically, the way I've structured this section is we will first talk about reading itself, why Postman believes it is valuable. Then we will also talk about the nature of television advertisements and why Postman believes they are the opposite of valuable. And then we will discuss why Postman believes that television advertisements and just the whole medium of television has corrupted political discourse. And we will end with a comparison of political debates in the past, in the age of typography, versus political debates in the age of television. And obviously we will, freak out because it's a big difference, guys. Oh my gosh. The first passage I would like to read and discuss comes on page 50, and this passage has to deal with just the act of reading and why Postman believes it is seriously valuable and seriously important if a society is to be, a serious society. A written sentence calls upon its author to say something, upon its reader to know the import of what is said. And when an author and reader are struggling with semantic meaning, they are engaged in the most serious challenge to the intellect. This is especially the case with the act of reading, for authors are not always trustworthy. They lie. They become confused. They overgeneralize. They abuse logic and, sometimes, common sense. The reader must come armed, in a serious state of intellectual readiness. This is not easy because he comes to the text alone. In reading, one's responses are isolated, one's intellect thrown back on its own resources. To be confronted by the cold abstractions of printed sentences is to look upon language bare, without the assistance of either beauty or community. Thus, reading is by its nature a serious business. It is also, of course, an essentially rational activity. Reading is hard, but by it being hard, that makes it serious, and makes it seriously good because of the benefits associated with putting your brain through something difficult, like deciphering a complex argument or a fallacious argument and figuring out that it's fallacious. All those things are hard, but reading, and if you read a whole lot, you will be able to have the mental strength necessary to discern what the truth is and what is not. You are literally deciphering code, and you're interacting with the critical thoughts of another person. And by doing that, you are learning how to critical think. If you do that enough, you're going to pick up some tricks. And I would also say that I've always noticed that when it comes to TV, you can watch TV and be, invested and really be thinking critically, but you have the choice not to. Like with most movies, with most television shows, you can passively watch. You can get up, go to the bathroom for 3 minutes and then come back, and you really haven't missed much. And it's not, you can kind of pick up right where it is. But that doesn't work for a book. Like if you read a book and you skip 3 pages, you're going to be very confused as to what's going on. And so a book requires you to be like, okay, I have to pay attention to everything. Whereas a TV show, you can pretty much get away with paying attention to almost nothing. This book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, more than any other book I've ever read, it just kind of confirmed what I already kind of believed. I have often said in the past number of years that, the 2016 election, the 2020 election, none of those things would have happened in the way that they happened. Like the candidates that were brought forth wouldn't have happened if we were a society that read books, not just contemporary books, but history, philosophy. If we were a society that did that, I was like, there's no way a Donald Trump or a Hillary Clinton could rise to the highest heights of politics. There's no way that a Joe Biden could become president. And I should also add, the chapter in which this passage comes in is called The Typographic Mind, and Postman gives way more arguments than this one as to why typography is such an important, medium to interact with. I just thought this passage it was just one passage that, kind of summed up why reading is so important. Now I would like to move on to the passages concerning television advertisements and how they are not, they're not by their nature a serious business. Now these passages on advertising and to a large extent the passages I will read concerning political discourse are coming from a chapter called Reach Out and Elect Someone. And what Postman attempts to argue, and I think he argues very effectively, is that the television commercial, the way it's formatted, that format basically took over the medium of television and made it to where the kinds of content that appear on television mimic the way a television commercial is formatted. So just keep that in mind whenever we do get to the passages specifically talking about political discourse in the age of television versus the age of typography. Now these passages I'm about to read come on page 127 and 128. By substituting images for claims, the pictorial commercial made emotional appeal, not tests of truth, the basis of consumer decisions. The distance between rationality and advertising is now so wide that it is difficult to remember that there once existed a connection between them. Today on television commercials, propositions are as scarce as unattractive people. The truth or falsity of an advertiser's claim is simply not an issue. A McDonald's commercial, for example, is not a series of testable, logically ordered assertions. It is a drama, a mythology, if you will, of handsome people selling, buying, and eating hamburgers, and being driven to near ecstasy by their good fortune. No claims are made except those the viewer projects onto or infers from the drama. One can like or dislike a television commercial, of course, but one cannot refute it. I mean, just think about it. Whenever you see a couple, young adults drinking Coca-Cola on a TV commercial, is there anything to refute in that? Is there any information given on, the sugar content in that Coke and how bad it is for you? No, that's not necessary. All that people need to see is someone else who they would like to be drinking that drink that might make them like that person drinking that drink. Reading on, indeed we may go this far. The television commercial is not at all about the character of products to be consumed. It is about the character of the consumers of products. Images of movie stars and famous athletes, of serene lakes and macho fishing trips, of elegant dinners and romantic interludes, of happy families packing their station wagons for a picnic in the country. These tell nothing about the products being sold, but they tell everything about the fears, fancies, and dreams of those who might buy them. What the advertiser needs to know is not what is right about the product, but what is wrong about the buyer. And so the balance of business expenditures shifts from product research to market research. The television commercial has oriented business away from making products of value and toward making consumers feel valuable, which means that the business of business has now become pseudotherapy. The consumer is a patient assured by psychodramas. I mean, I have to say that Postman's claim in light of today regarding television commercials and just the way all those things are oriented, I mean, that's absolutely true. Like when you see an erectile dysfunction commercial, it's just like, a 55-year-old man smiling at his wife who's clearly pleased now that he's, pleasing her. But there's no information as to whether or not the pill he's taking is, more effective than the next pill. There's not usually any factual claims in these commercials. It's just, hey, if you're a man with erectile dysfunction, you could be happy if you take this pill, and your wife could look at you in the way that this woman is looking at this man in the commercial you're watching. But that is all commercials are like now. Now the next passage I would like to read and discuss comes on page 136, and there's something you should understand about this particular passage before reading it. There's a phrase called image politics in here, and essentially what Postman means by that is that politics in the age of television has become not, about content or about positions or policies. It's become about image. What I'm saying is that just as the television commercial empties itself of authentic product information so that it can do its psychological work, image politics empties itself of authentic political substance for the same reason. It follows from this that history can play no significant role in image politics. For history is of value only to someone who takes seriously the notion that there are patterns in the past which may provide the present with nourishing traditions. The past is a world, Thomas Carlyle said, and not a void of gray haze. But he wrote this at a time when the book was the principal medium of serious public discourse. A book is all history. Everything about it takes one back in time, from the way it is produced, to its linear mode of exposition, to the fact that the past tense is its most comfortable form of address. As no other medium before or since, the book promotes the sense of a coherent and usable past. In a conversation of books history, as Carlyle understood it, it is not only a world, but a living world. It is the present that is shadowy. What Postman is beginning to argue here is that, just given the way television is set up, and if a society uses television as its primary means of understanding itself, history is much less important to that society because history is much less important to the medium of television. Whereas history is fundamental to a book. It's all about what's already happened. Whereas a TV commercial about kids drinking Coke, that has no context given to it as far as what time this is taking place. For all you know, that's happening right now, and you could have that Coke and be experiencing that now too. It's not that the television commercial has, or TV culture has obliterated history, it's just made it less important. Continuing along with that line of thought, let's go ahead and read the next passage that also falls on page 136 and ends on page 137. Czesław Milosz, winner of the 1980 Nobel Prize for Literature, remarked in his acceptance speech in Stockholm that our age is characterized by a refusal to remember. He cited, among other things, the staggering fact that there are now more than 100 books in print that deny the Holocaust ever took place. The historian Karl Shortsky has, in my opinion, circled closer to the truth by noting that the modern mind has grown indifferent to history because history has become useless to it. In other words, it is not obstinacy or ignorance, but a sense of irrelevance that leads to the diminution of history. Television's Bill Moyers inches still closer when he says, "I worry that my own business helps to make this an anxious age of agitated amnesiacs. We Americans seem to know everything about the last 24 hours, but very little of the last 60 centuries, or the last 60 years." Terence Moran, I believe, lands on the target in saying that with media whose structure is biased toward furnishing images in fragments, we are deprived of access to a historical perspective. In the absence of continuity and context, he says, bits of information cannot be integrated into an intelligent and consistent whole. We do not refuse to remember, neither do we find it exactly useless to remember. Rather, we are being rendered unfit to remember. I would say a lot of that rings true. I mean, it says, we are deprived of access to a historical perspective due to a media whose structure is biased towards furnishing images and fragments. Television is absolutely furnished towards images and fragments. I mean, people, think they can understand what's happening in the world in a 22-minute segment on Fox News or CNN. That's insane. It's insane that anyone thinks that they can understand the world in that amount of time, and yet we do. Those are all fragments of information that are just compiled together in a montage, and usually that information is wildly incomplete. Even when history is brought up in public discourse today, it is brought up in fragments. Like I remember this past summer, or summer before last in 2020, whenever the George Floyd protests and stuff was going on, a lot of people were like quoting Martin Luther King, saying like, a riot is the language of the unheard. But I was like, wait, that's one line in a giant speech. You can't use that as a reason to go out and break windows, And I was like, what's the context of that line? And I haven't read the speech, but I bet it was not, hey, you can go steal a television now. I bet that wasn't the purpose of that line. History books, they give you kind of a through line. There's a logic. There's whoever's writing that book is compiled information into a consistent whole that you can kind of understand. And they spent years working on it, doing lots and lots of research, whereas an equal to that is not found on television. Now I'd like to read the next passage, which is just down the page on 137. If these conjectures make sense, then in this Orwell was wrong once again, at least for the Western democracies. He envisioned the demolition of history, but believed that it would be accomplished by the state, that some equivalent of the Ministry of Truth would systematically banish inconvenient facts and destroy the records of the past. Certainly, this is the way of the Soviet Union, our modern-day Oceania. But as Huxley more accurately foretold it, nothing so crude as all that is required. Seemingly benign technologies devoted to providing the populace with a politics of image, instancy, and therapy may disappear history just as effectively, perhaps more permanently, and without objection. I like reading history books. I'm a big fan of biographies and that sort of thing. I'm the only person I know that really does that. I mean, maybe I know one friend that likes to read history books and that sort of thing. But most people don't want to sit down, don't want to take the time to read because reading is hard. And so effectively, history in America has been vanishing due to the fact that in order to actually have a good picture of history, that requires American citizens to do some hard work and research that they don't want to do. In fact, they'd much rather just hang out with those seemingly benign technologies that devote themselves to a politics of image, instancy, and therapy. Now we've come to this point in the section where we will discuss, the impact of TV advertisements and just, the medium of television on political discourse versus the way political discourse was conducted back in the days of Abraham Lincoln. Postman talks about the Lincoln-Douglas debates at a couple points during this book, and he remarks that those debates went on for hours and hours, like no commercial breaks, nothing like that. Just Lincoln and Douglas standing up on tree stumps in front of people in a town square and just debating. And he describes how people would sit there and they would listen to these lengthy responses. So let's go ahead and read the first passage regarding the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which comes on page 48. I choose the Lincoln-Douglas debates as a starting point for this chapter, not only because they were the preeminent example of political discourse in the mid-19th century, but also because they illustrate the power of typography to control the character of that discourse. Both the speakers and their audiences were habituated to a kind of oratory that may be described as literary. For all of the hoopla and socializing surrounding the event, the speakers had little to offer and the audiences little to expect but language. And the language that was offered was clearly modeled on the style of the written word. This next passage offers a great example of what I just read there of Postman. This is coming on page 46, and this just shows how typography, the way writing was done back in Lincoln's era, was the way speaking was done as well. And it made for some very impressive oratory skills in both Lincoln and Douglas and all the politicians of that time. I mean, it's a stark difference from today, as we shall see. In the second debate at Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln rose to answer Douglas in the following words. It will readily occur to you that I cannot, in half an hour, notice all the things that so able a man as Judge Douglas can say in an hour and a half. And I hope, therefore, if there be anything that he has said upon which you would like to hear something from me, but which I omit to comment upon, you will bear in mind that it would be expecting an impossibility for me to cover his whole ground. Now reading Postman's words yet again. It is hard to imagine the present occupant of the White House being capable of constructing such clauses in similar circumstances. And if he were, he would surely do so at the risk of burdening the comprehension or concentration of his audience. People of a television culture need plain language, both orally and visually, and will even go so far as to require it in some circumstances by law. The Gettysburg Address would probably have been largely incomprehensible to a 1985 audience. This point is just kind of obvious on its face. Like, can you imagine Donald Trump saying anything remotely like what Lincoln just said? What about Biden? I think Biden would make it through like the first half of the first quarter of the first sentence before he went,
we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
And it's important to keep in mind that like paragraph that Lincoln spoke, that was on a whim. And it's very clear, and this is Postman's point, that Lincoln was a reader. Like, he really could read, and that influenced the way he talked. Now let's talk about the presidential election that happened in 1984. This is something that Postman discusses on page 97, and let's just go ahead and read that. And the contrast between what happened in the 1994 presidential debate versus the Lincoln and Douglas debates, it's pretty clear on its face. Prior to the 1984 presidential elections, the two candidates confronted each other on television in what were called debates. These events were not in the least like the Lincoln-Douglas debates or anything else that goes by the name. Each candidate was given 5 minutes to address such questions as, what is or would be your policy in Central America? His opposite number was then given 1 minute for a rebuttal. In such circumstances, complexity, documentation, and logic can play no role, and indeed, on several occasions, syntax itself was abandoned entirely. It is no matter. The men were less concerned with giving arguments than with giving off impressions, which is what television does best. Post-debate commentary largely avoided any evaluation of the candidates' ideas, since there were none to evaluate. Instead, the debates were conceived as boxing matches, the relevant question being, who KO'd whom? The answer was determined by the style of the men, how they looked, fixed their gaze, smiled, and delivered one-liners. In the second debate, President Reagan got off a swell one-liner when asked a question about his age. The following day, several newspapers indicated that Ron had KO'd Fritz with his joke. Thus, the leader of the free world is chosen by the people in the age of television. Now let's move on to page 133, which kind of plays off of that passage I just read, and it kind of brings it all full circle to discussions surrounding the television commercial. The point is that television does not reveal who the best man is. In fact, television makes impossible the determination of who is better than whom. If we mean by better such things as more capable in negotiation, more imaginative in executive skill, more knowledgeable about international affairs, more understanding of the interrelations of economic systems, and so on. The reason has almost entirely to do with image. But not because politicians are preoccupied with presenting themselves in the best possible light. After all, who isn't? It is a rare and deeply disturbed person who does not wish to project a favorable image. But television gives image a bad name. For on television, the politician does not so much offer the audience an image of himself, as offer himself as an image of the audience. And therein lies one of the most powerful influences of the television commercial on political discourse. There's no product information that's really communicated in most commercials. It's just, man, I wish I could be like that. And Postman's point is the same rule applies for televised presidential debates. It's not about who's more capable as a president. It's not about who is more experienced. It's about who's handsomer or prettier. It's about who's more charismatic. And it's about who is the most quick-witted. It's all about image. Those who read can know, those who watch can only see is a fairly good title for this section. Television is very seductive in that it gives you the feeling of being informed when in reality you're not informed at all. Which leads naturally to our next section, which is called, If You Think Television News Sucks, You're Right. When Postman discusses television news in this book, surprise, surprise, his conclusion is that the television, that medium, has transformed the news into entertainment. But let's read specifically why he believes that by starting with a passage on page 87. Entertainment is the supra-ideology of all discourse on television. No matter what is depicted or from what point of view, the overarching presumption is that it is there for our amusement and pleasure. That is why even on news shows, which provide us daily with fragments of tragedy and barbarism, we are urged by the newscasters to join them tomorrow. What for? One would think that several minutes of murder and mayhem would suffice as material for a month of sleepless nights. We accept the newscaster's invitation because we know that the news is not to be taken seriously, that it is all in fun, so to say. Everything about a news show tells us this. The good looks and amiability of the cast, Their pleasant banter, the exciting music that opens and closes the show, the vivid film footage, the attractive commercials, all these and more suggest that what we have just seen is no cause for weeping. A news show, to put it plainly, is a format for entertainment, not for education, reflection, or catharsis. He's got a point, because when you think about it, when it comes to like a television news host, most often, the person that's picked for that job is not the best reporter. It's whoever's the best speaker, whoever's the most charismatic, whoever can present the news in the most entertaining and engaging way. Moving on to page 99, Postman describes what he calls the now this structure that is inherent to television news, and that makes it inherently ridiculous. Now this is commonly used on radio and television newscasts to indicate that what one has just heard or seen has no relevance to what one is about to hear or see, or possibly to anything one is ever likely to hear or see. The phrase is a means of acknowledging the fact that the world as mapped by the speeded up electronic media has no order or meaning and is not to be taken seriously. There is no murder so brutal, no earthquake so devastating, no political blunder so costly, for that matter, no ball score so tantalizing or weather report so threatening that it cannot be erased from our minds by a newscaster saying, "Now this." At the end of one story, a newscaster might be saying, and this woman was raped repeatedly by 5 men, and then within an instant he's like, "Now this, a child in a park riding a bicycle. Isn't it great, Cheryl, how the kids are getting out these days and playing?" I remember when I was a kid. It makes the whole thing a joke, like a really sickly entertaining joke, is what Postman's point is. Now I'd like to read a passage on page 104 that kind of works hand in hand with what we've been talking about. The viewers also know that no matter how grave any fragment of news may appear, for example, on the day I write, a Marine Corps general has declared that nuclear war between the United States and Russia is inevitable, it will shortly be followed by a series of commercials that will, in an instant, diffuse the import of the news. In fact, render it largely banal. This is a key element in the structure of a news program, and all by itself refutes any claim that television news is designed as a serious form of public discourse. Imagine what you would think of me and this book if I were to pause here, tell you that I will return to my discussion in a moment, and then proceed to write a few words in behalf of United Airlines or the Chase Manhattan Bank. You would rightly think that I had no respect for you, and certainly no respect for the subject. And if I did this not once but several times in each chapter, you would think the whole enterprise unworthy of your attention. Why then do we not think a news show similarly unworthy? The reason, I believe, is that whereas we expect books and even other media, such as film, to maintain a consistency of tone and a continuity of content, we have no such expectation of television, and especially television news. Postman just put into words the feeling I've always had regarding television news. I've always thought, this is ridiculous. This is just like making everybody hateful and stupid. Now that I have the words at my disposal to illustrate this fact, maybe I'll get my parents to read this book so that way I don't have to deal with coming home on the weekend and listening to them yell at the TV news guy. Now this next passage comes on page 107, and this is where Postman, I think, makes a really good point about television news. Even if television covers a news story extensively, it's still not going to effectively inform people. And he begins by talking about the Iranian hostage crisis, immediately preceding the passage that I'm going to read. And he talks about how, this hostage crisis had so many viewers looking at the TV and watching and going, whoa, what's going on? So wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that, people were informed about this news event? But then again, isn't it an exaggeration to say that most people don't know what Ayatollah means? Or who the Shah was in this situation? He poses all these questions, like these specific details that are actually really important, but that television news never takes the time to go into, like the actual tenets of Islam and all this stuff. And, he's like, I'm not so sure that everybody was informed about the Iranian hostage crisis. I think they just were fed a whole bunch of fragments of information, but nothing truly deep, or at least deep enough to bring about, comprehensive understanding. And so now we will read a passage here where Postman talks about a word that's come up in recent years a lot, and that word is disinformation. What is happening here is that television is altering the meaning of being informed by creating a species of information that might properly be called disinformation. I am using this word almost in the precise sense in which it is used by spies in the CIA or KGB. Disinformation does not mean false information. It means misleading information, misplaced, irrelevant, fragmented, or superficial information. Information that creates the illusion of knowing something, but which in fact leads one away from knowing. In saying this, I do not mean to imply that television news deliberately aims to deprive Americans of a coherent, contextual understanding of the world. I mean to say that when news is packaged as entertainment, that is the inevitable result. And in saying that the television news show entertains but does not inform, I am saying something far more serious than that we are being deprived of authentic information. I am saying we are losing our sense of what it means to be well informed. Ignorance is always correctable. But what shall we do if we take ignorance to be knowledge? So in other words, what Postman is saying is that the Iranian hostage crisis was packaged on television to be engaging to the viewer. And that means you don't go in depth on any of the real nitty-gritty details of what's going on. You don't go into depth with regards to Islam or why some people liked this particular leader versus another. You don't go into those things because those things make for boring and difficult television. No, what you do is you give a brief overview. You show destruction. You show all these things. You give those details. You bias the story towards those details because those are the most entertaining, the most engaging, and those will get people to tune in continuously. That is what Postman is saying, and he's saying that by television packaging news that way, it creates the illusion of an audience knowing something without actually knowing anything. You know, I mentioned like the George Floyd, summer of protests and riots, and that's just a perfect example of what Postman describes here of people. I mean, you could just pick your entertainment package back then, depending on the news station. CNN was more for the left-wing people who wanted to think that, there was such a thing as fiery but mostly peaceful protests. That's literally a headline that CNN ran on a news show. If you were on the right, then you might watch Fox News, where you are fed an endless stream of riot footage showing, the harshest of the protests that devolved into riots during that era. That's what you were given. You were just given one narrative over the next. Both were just fragments of information, like just collected fragments that did not actually give you a good picture of what's going on. In that sense, what CNN does and what Fox News does on many stories could be considered disinformation. That's what Postman's point is, and I think he's correct. And I also agree with what Postman says here on page 106. He says, the result of all this is that Americans are the best entertained and quite likely the least well-informed people in the Western world. Now to end this section, we shall read a passage that comes on page 110 and ends on page 111, where Postman yet again compares and contrasts the worlds presented by George Orwell and Aldous Huxley. And here Postman just observes the fact that no totalitarian dictatorship was necessary in America for people to be confused and for them not to be able to discern the truth. For all his perspicacity, George Orwell would have been stymied by this situation. There is nothing Orwellian about it. The president does not have the press under his thumb. The New York Times and the Washington Post are not Pravda. The Associated Press is not TASS. And there is no newspeak here. Lies have not been defined as truth, nor truth as lies. All that has happened is that the public has adjusted to incoherence and been amused into indifference. Which is why Aldous Huxley would not in the least be surprised by the story. Indeed, he prophesied its coming. He believed that it is far more likely that the Western democracies will dance and dream themselves into oblivion than march into it single file and manacled. Huxley grasped, as Orwell did not, that it is not necessary to conceal anything from a public insensible to contradiction and narcoticized by technological diversions. Although Huxley did not specify that television would be our main line to the drug, he would have no difficulty accepting Robert McNeil's observation. that television is the soma of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Big Brother turns out to be Howdy Doody. And Howdy Doody turns out to be God. The next section of this video is titled, God Isn't Dead. Look! There he is on the TV! Many of the passages that we're going to go over in this section come from the chapter Shuffle Off to Bethlehem, where Postman talks about televangelism and how entertainment culture and just TV had begun during his time to change religion, and more specifically Christianity, into something almost unrecognizable, shallow, and just kind of weird. And I have to say, what he writes here definitely hits home, because I mean, when you look at a lot of churches, almost all, churches with any sizable congregation have some sort of video option. And I don't disparage having a video option, but I mean, look, I used to go to Life Church, and they certainly have done a lot of great things, no doubt. But when I was reading this chapter and what Postman has to write here about religion becoming entertainment, I had to think of Life Church, because Life Church, when you go there, or if you watch online or whatever, it's a production. First passage I'd like to read and discuss comes on page 121. The executive director of the National Religious Broadcasters Association sums up what he calls the unwritten law of all television preachers. You can get your share of the audience only by offering people something they want. You will note, I am sure, that this is an unusual religious credo. There is no great religious leader, from the Buddha to Moses to Jesus to Muhammad to Luther, who offered people what they want, only what they need. But television is not well suited to offering people what they need. It is user-friendly. It is too easy to turn off. It is at its most alluring when it speaks the language of dynamic visual imagery. It does not accommodate complex language or stringent demands. As a consequence, what is preached on television is not anything like the Sermon on the Mount. Religious programs are filled with good cheer. They celebrate affluence. Their featured players become celebrities. Though their messages are trivial, the shows have high ratings, or rather, because their messages are trivial, the shows have high ratings. I believe I am not mistaken in saying that Christianity is a demanding and serious religion. When it is delivered as easy and amusing, it is another kind of religion altogether. So again, Postman's driving, this point home that, some things that are of real substance are just not suited for television. And religion, there's a lot of aspects to religion that, they're just not suited for, a television program. And so what he's basically arguing is that whenever people try to televise religion, they have to cut out all the boring and nitty-gritty details to make it entertaining, which means that the religion's kind of being debased and stripped of its real fiber. The Sermon on the Mount is not something that you typically see on television, because it's not quite as appealing as somebody yelling about the devil and vaccines. Continuing on, there are of course counter-arguments to the claim that television degrades religion. Among them is that spectacle is hardly a stranger to religion. If one puts aside the Quakers and a few other austere sects, every religion tries to make itself appealing through art, music, icons, and awe-inspiring ritual. The aesthetic dimension to religion is the source of its attraction to many people. This is especially true of Roman Catholicism and Judaism, which supply their congregants with haunting chants, magnificent robes and shawls, magical hats, wafers and wine, stained glass windows, and the mysterious cadences of ancient languages. The difference between these accoutrements of religion and the floral displays, fountains, and elaborate sets we see on television is that the former are not, in fact, accoutrements, but integral parts of the history and doctrines of the religion itself. They require congregants to respond to them with suitable reverence. A Jew does not cover his head at prayer because a skull cap looks good on television. A Catholic does not light a votive candle to improve the look of the altar. Rabbis, priests, and Presbyterian ministers do not, in the midst of a service, take testimony from movie stars to find out why they are religious people. The spectacle we find in true religions has as its purpose enchantment, not entertainment. The distinction is critical. By endowing things with magic, enchantment is the means through which we may gain access to sacredness. Entertainment is the means through which we distance ourselves from it. Again, I have to think of like Life Church with the light shows and stuff. I like the fact that Life Church has, put the Bible online free for everybody, the Bible app. They've done a lot of charity work. And I've listened to some of their sermons or seen some of their sermons in person, and they're real good. But I got to say, when I'm there and I see the light show and the elaborate musical sets and the cool hip haircuts and fashion and all that stuff, I go, this is just, this doesn't feel like church. This feels like a church trying to be like a rock concert, not because there's any symbolism or meaning in the rock concert setup, but just because the church knows that if they act like a rock concert, they'll probably get more people to show up and be entertained by that rock concert. Continuing, the reply to this is that most of the religion available to us on television is fundamentalist, which explicitly disdains ritual and theology in favor of direct communication with the Bible itself, that is, with God. Without ensnaring myself in a theological argument, for which I am unprepared, I think it both fair and obvious to say that on television, God is a vague and subordinate character. Though his name is invoked repeatedly, the concreteness and persistence of the image of the preacher carries the clear message that it is he, not he, who must be worshipped. I do not mean to imply that the preacher wishes it to be so, only that the power of a close-up, televised face in color makes idolatry a continual hazard. Television is, after all, a form of graven imagery far more alluring than a golden calf. I suspect, though I have no external evidence of it, that Catholic objections to Bishop Fulton Sheen's theatrical performances on television of several years back sprang from the impression that viewers were misdirecting their devotions away from God and toward Bishop Sheen, whose piercing eyes, awesome cape, and stately tones were as close a resemblance to a deity as charisma allows. It's very easy for people to mistake the preacher in their mind's eye, whether consciously or not, for being the real person to be worshipped rather than God. When you look at actors and celebrities, they're basically worshipped because, they just look good on screen. And Postman's saying, look, that same rule can apply for religious figures as well, which would be probably the opposite of what they want, but nevertheless, TV lends itself to that kind of problem arising. Now I'd like to move on to page 124, where Postman writes, as a member of the Commission on Theology, Education, and the Electronic Media of the National Council of the Churches of Christ, I am aware of the deep concern among established Protestant religions about the tendency toward refashioning Protestant services so that they are more televisable. It is well understood at the National Council that the danger is not that religion has become the content of television shows, but that television shows may become the content of religion. Life Church literally has, or at least they have had in the past, an At the Movies series where they look at movie scenes, maybe even TV scenes, and preach sermons on them. Now obviously they're tying those scenes back to the Bible, and they're looking for the themes that are congruent with what's in the Bible. And honestly, like whenever I've seen those sermons, I get something out of them. I think that there's certainly some merit to them, but it's one of those things where you're like, yeah, this is a little odd that we're analyzing a movie in a church. Now, the last passage I would like to read and discuss comes on page 155, and the reason I like to discuss it is because it has to deal with culture. It doesn't explicitly reference religion, but it does talk about culture, and it just must be said from the outset that religion, more than any other force in human history, has created culture. Particularly in America, Christianity underpins our culture, all the way through. And I think part of the reason we've experienced so much instability of late is because fewer and fewer people are consulting church, Christianity, religion, and so we're becoming detached from the things that underpin our culture, and that's just kind of leading to mass kind of confusion. Religion, it informs pretty much all the stories that are in a given culture. Like in America, most popular story ever told besides the Bible is Harry Potter, and that is basically the Bible right there. I mean, it features a boy who has to die, be resurrected, and then vanquish the Dark Lord after that's been done. I mean, it's right there. It's just a Christ narrative through and through. I just want you to keep that in mind as we read this passage because it's relevant. What Huxley teaches is that in the age of advanced technology, spiritual devastation is more likely to come from an enemy with a smiling face than from one whose countenance exudes suspicion and hate. And the Huxleyan prophecy, Big Brother does not watch us by his choice. We watch him by ours. There is no need for wardens or gates or ministries of truth. When a population becomes distracted by trivia, when cultural life is redefined as a perpetual round of entertainments, when serious public conversation becomes a form of baby talk, when, in short, a people become an audience and their public business a vaudeville act, then a nation finds itself at risk. Culture death is a clear possibility. And I would also add, and I think this is congruent with what Postman would say, that when religion becomes trivial, when religion becomes shallow, when religion becomes a vaudeville act, a form of entertainment, then yes, culture death is a clear possibility. And I think that's the possibility that we're facing in particularly America right now. If a society has forgotten what it believed in the past, then how in the world is it supposed to figure out what it's supposed to believe in the future? You know what I'm saying? All right, now the next section in this video on amusing ourselves to death is called Marx Was Right About Some Things. Now, Karl Marx is an interesting fellow. I read and did an analysis of his Communist Manifesto on this channel. I'll leave an end screen and a card for it, probably. You know, his name actually kind of makes sense to come up in this video, and Postman actually brings it up in the book. That's why I'm talking about him. Because, you know, the big question is why? Why did American culture just instantly displace print, you know, the book, with the TV show? Like, why did that occur? And I would like to read a passage from page 6 of this book where Postman addresses, you know, some of the Marxist ideas regarding entertainment and why it went in the direction it went in after the invention of the television. Those who have written vigorously on the matter tell us, for example, that what is happening is the residue of an exhausted capitalism, or on the contrary, that it is the tasteless fruit of the maturing of capitalism, or that it is the neurotic aftermath of the age of Freud, or the retribution of our allowing God to perish, or that it all comes from the old standbys, greed, and ambition. I have attended carefully to these explanations, and I do not say that there is nothing to learn from them. Marxists, Freudians, Levi-Straussians, even creation scientists are not to be taken lightly. Now, obviously there, Postman is not making a Marxist argument, but he is acknowledging that some Marxist ideas regarding capitalism, and more specifically capitalism's effect on entertainment, do have some merit. And Postman actually references certain Marxist ideas over the course of his book. And I gotta say, I would like to stop here though before we read those other passages and actually read a couple passages from my Media, Culture, and Society book. It's a textbook in one of my college classes, Entertainment and the Media. I don't know, they certainly are congruent with some of the things that Postman has to say about television and how it affects all modes of discourse. So I'd just like to read one short little passage from 101, and then we'll discuss. For Marx, the dominant ways of thinking in a society always will reflect the prevailing mode of production and the interests of the ruling class. Writing in 1859, he put it in the following way: the mode of production of material life determines the general character of the social, political, and spiritual processes of life. Now, what I find so interesting about this passage is, you know, the way that Marx talked about capitalism and the way it affects all aspects of society and how people interact and how they, you know, work and all those things. It's precisely the same way that Postman talks about the television affecting the way people perceive the world and interact with each other and all that stuff. And I just think that's really, really interesting. The next passage I would like to discuss from this book is on page 102, and I would just like to read this as I think these, some of these people and some of their ideas that are discussed here are some of those ideas that Postman was referring to as having some merit. While Marx regarded ideology as a discernible set of ideas which emerged from capitalist relations, the Frankfurt School's analysis of the ideological role of media and culture envisages something more all-pervasive. Describing the rise of what they term the culture industry, Adorno and Horkheimer, 1997, argue that, like everything else, human expression and creativity has been subsumed into the capitalist logic and surrendered to its relentless processes of instrumentality and rationalization. From their point of view, art in its pure form represented everything important about human subjectivity, including creativity, freedom, and independent critical thought. Under capitalism, however, art had become a mass commodity, little different from the range of other industrial products on the market. For Adorno, culture ceases to be a creative social relationship between artist and audience then and becomes reified into a set of anonymous consumer objects exchanged for money. Look, the television was produced by capitalism and it's used by capitalists, and therefore it's going to lend itself to certain uses, primarily towards capitalist uses, is what these Marxist thinkers thought. One such thing that Postman specifically acknowledges Marx being correct about was the ability of certain mediums to completely change discourse. I read here from page 42 and on to page 43. I offer Karl Marx from the German ideology. Is the Iliad possible, he asks rhetorically, when the printing press and even printing machines exist? Is it not inevitable that with the emergence of the press, the singing and the telling and the muse cease? That is, the conditions necessary for epic poetry disappear? Marx understood well that the press was not merely a machine, but a structure for discourse, which both rules out and insists upon certain kinds of content and inevitably a certain kind of audience. And I believe the reason Postman brought that up was obviously, he believed that Marx would probably say the same for television, and therefore agree with him in his deconstruction of television. One thing that I've certainly thought in recent times with the rise of big tech corporations and the amount of control and influence they can exercise is that left-wing critiques of capitalism have been proven true, or at least of crooked capitalism have been proven true, in that, Google, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, they do have a tremendous amount of power to control speech, more power than the government. And this is something that a lot of people did not foresee, but it's something that certainly the left foresaw. What's strange is that a lot of left-wing people are happy about Google banning people, which is like, nothing makes sense in this world. We've all amused ourselves into insanity. It's pretty wild how much in common we have with the people of 1985 in the year 2021, in that, there were massive corporations then that controlled public discourse, controlled which ideas were allowed on TV and which ideas were not. And of course, this is an idea that is congruent with Marxist theories about capitalism. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this short little passage on page 139, and we will discuss it further. The Bill of Rights is largely a prescription for preventing government from restricting the flow of information and ideas. But the Founding Fathers did not foresee that tyranny by government might be superseded by another sort of problem altogether, namely the corporate state, which through television now controls the flow of public discourse in America. And so I will conclude this section of the video by saying what I said at the beginning, which is that Marx was right about some things. The last section of this video is titled, Was Postman and Huxley right about everything? Are there any solutions? Or are we doomed? Well, it's definitely clear to me that Postman was wrong about Orwell in some ways. It's my belief that we're kind of living in a freakish hybrid between the Brave New World and 1984. I'd like to read just a couple things from 1984 to kind of back up that claim. This is on page 3. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. But at any rate, they could plug in your wire wherever they wanted to. You did live, from habit that became instinct, and the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and, except in darkness, every moment scrutinized. So this passage comes in 1984, obviously right towards the beginning. The main character, Winston, is kind of talking, thinking about, how he lives in a surveillance state where there's certain thoughts that are allowed, and certain thoughts that are not, and you've got to always be alert. And look, the matter of fact is that, you know, we now have the technology that does kind of watch us and listen to us all the time. If Big Brother, if I became a problematic individual in society, then yeah, the government could, you know, they have the resources to tap into my cell phone or my laptop and observe me and gather information on me and surveil me. And so I do think that Postman was wrong about that reality not happening in the West, because it's beginning to happen. Now, the next passage I would like to read and discuss from 1984 that's relevant to this discussion comes on page 80, where Orwell talks about the party, you know, the centralized political state, and their willingness to try and force people to believe lies. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make that claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it. Not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense. All I will say is that when Twitter suspends a politician for saying men cannot get pregnant, that's pretty damn close to suspending somebody for saying that 2 + 2 = 4 instead of 5. So, yeah. And I would also say that Postman was incorrect about, you know, the jackboots coming out in some Western countries. I mean, it's true that, I mean, 5 years ago, I would have pretty much agreed with Postman in that, yeah, we were living more in the Huxleyan world. The Orwellian world is just mostly in the East and like China and stuff. But no, even in Western democracies, I mean, Australia went like full totalitarian in a very short amount of time. The jackboots came out there. They were arresting people for leaving their homes. You know, the 1984 world is rearing its ugly head at the same time as the Huxleyan world. I still agree with Postman that the Huxleyan world, at least in the West, is more prominent, but his casual disregard for 1984 type situations arising in the West, I think was incorrect. Now, to close out this section, I'd like to read just a couple more passages from Amusing Ourselves to Death and just ask the question, was Postman correct whenever he said these things? Or was he wrong, or is the answer somewhere in the middle? Passage number 1 and number 2 come from page 80. Our culture's adjustment to the epistemology of television is by now all but complete. We have so thoroughly accepted its definitions of truth, knowledge, and reality that irrelevance seems to us to be filled with import, and incoherence seems imminently sane. And if some of our institutions seem not to fit the template of the times, why, it is they, and not the template, that seem to us disordered and strange. We're being forced to care about things that we would never care about otherwise if it weren't for these entertainment media systems constantly bombarding us with information. And yeah, things do seem very disordered and strange. And so I would say, yeah, that he was correct about that. Next passage. Television, in other words, is transforming our culture into one vast arena for show business. It is entirely possible, of course, that in the end we shall find that delightful and decide we like it just fine. That is exactly what Aldous Huxley feared was coming 50 years ago. Here I would say Postman was actually wrong. It is true that television, you know, is transforming our culture into one vast arena for show business. I do agree with that. I think he makes a very strong case for that in this book. But when he says it is entirely possible, of course, that in the end we shall find that delightful and decide we like it just fine, I think he's wrong. It's pretty clear. People are really unhappy right now, like with everything. People may not be able to identify what exactly is wrong, but people can identify that something is very wrong. And this is on all sides of the political spectrum and religious spectrum and, you know, etc. So I would say Postman was incorrect about us, you know, actually finding, you know, the Huxleyan world satisfactory. Moving on to page 141, Postman writes, television clearly does impair the student's freedom to read, and it does so with innocent hands, so to speak. Television does not ban books, it simply displaces them. I would say here that Postman is correct. Television has largely displaced books. People aren't even interested in reading books these days, at least most people. And so, by television just being an easier medium to interact with, it has affected people's ability to read and be interested in reading. Next passage. The fight against censorship is a 19th century issue which was largely won in the 20th. What we are confronted with now is the problem posed by the economic and symbolic structure of television. Those who run television do not limit our access to information, but in fact widen it. Our Ministry of Culture is Huxleyan, not Orwellian. It does everything possible to encourage us to watch continuously, but what we watch is a medium which presents information in a form that renders it simplistic, non-substantive, non-historical, and non-contextual. That is to say, information packaged as entertainment. In America, we are never denied the opportunity to amuse ourselves. I would say that Postman is like 100% correct with this. My television screen in my pocket is constructed, all the apps on the phone are created to try and get me to watch continuously. And to be constantly bombarded with simplistic, non-substantive, non-historical, and non-contextual information, typically. For all the bullcrap information that this television screen supplies, there's a ton of great information on there too, but there's just so much information that it's hard to sort it all out. And so again, yeah, I would say Postman was correct in what he said here. The next passage I would like to read and discuss comes on page 45, where Postman discusses attention spans. From today versus back whenever people were listening to the Lincoln Douglas debates. And so just keep in mind in this first sentence, whenever it talks about, for one thing, its attention span, by its it means the crowds that viewed the Lincoln Douglas debates. For one thing, its attention span would obviously have been extraordinary by current standards. Is there any audience of Americans today who could endure 7 hours of talk, or 5, or 3? I would say surprisingly that Postman was wrong here about the future. It is true that a lot of people don't want to hang out in a town square and listen to two politicians debate each other for 5 hours. That's true, people aren't willing to do that. But people's attention spans are not what Postman thought they were. And my example for why I believe this to be the case is podcasts. Podcasts have proven that people will listen to a conversation for 3 or more hours. Case in point, the Joe Rogan Experience, the probably most popular podcast in the world. The average episode is like 3 hours long, okay? And people tune in. Look, 48 million people tuned into the episode where Elon Musk did this. 48 million people. And that episode was like 2.5 hours long. It was just the two of them talking. So I would say that Postman was incorrect when he said that people couldn't sit still or tolerate a conversation like that. There's millions upon millions of people that are interested in long-form discussions. And I think Postman would actually see podcasts as a reason for hope. Because people will watch debates if they're done in the podcast format. They will listen to those things. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have finally come to the last passage in this, book talk on Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. And this last passage has to do with what Postman believes could be done to essentially save the world from a catastrophic future ruled by show business. This passage comes on 162, and this is actually the very last passage in the book. So we've gone all the way in this one, ladies and gentlemen. Educators are not unaware of the effects of television on their students. Stimulated by the arrival of the computer, they discuss it a great deal, which is to say, they have become somewhat media conscious. It is true enough that much of their consciousness centers on the question, how can we use television or the computer or word processor to control education? They have not yet got to the question, how can we use education to control television or the computer or word processor? But our reach for solutions ought to exceed our present grasp, or what's our dreaming for? Besides, it is an acknowledged task of the schools to assist the young in learning how to interpret the symbols of their culture. That this task should now require that they learn how to distance themselves from their forms of information is not so bizarre an enterprise that we cannot hope for its inclusion in the curriculum. Even hope that it will be placed at the center of education. What I suggest here as a solution is what Aldous Huxley suggested as well, and I can do no better than he. He believed with H.G. Wells that we are in a race between education and disaster, and he wrote continuously about the necessity of our understanding the politics and epistemology of media. For in the end, he was trying to tell us that what afflicted the people in Brave New World was not that they were laughing instead of thinking, but that they did not know what they were laughing about and why they had stopped thinking. So essentially what Postman was saying here is the way to prevent generations from being brainwashed by the television and its evolutions is to educate those children on how to distinguish, good symbols in culture from bad symbols in culture. I mean, Huxley wrote about children should be educated on how to identify what is and isn't propaganda. Obviously, Postman is suggesting here that children should be educated on how to distance themselves from these technologies or use them with intention. And I would agree that that is something that needs to be taught in schools, and I would actually say that this book should be taught in schools. I think young people in high school should read this book and read Brave New World, read 1984. I do think Postman was right about those being potential solutions, although I think those solutions have never been put into practice, so we might be doomed. All right, now, ladies and gentlemen, that'll do it for this video review and analysis of Amusing Ourselves to Death. I hope you got something out of that marathon that we just got through. So much reading, so much talking. But anyways, now I want to know if you guys have read Amusing Ourselves to Death. What did you think of it? If you liked it or you hated it, please leave whatever comments you might have in the comment section below. And as always, if you like this video, please like it and subscribe. Tell your friends about the channel. And never forget to